Joining our discussion now, Christine Lucius, a former staff director for the Senate Judiciary Committee. She's the executive vice president of the Leadership Conference, and Lisa Graves, co-director of Documented. She is a former chief counsel for nominations for the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary on the Democratic side. She was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice. And Christine, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Lisa has been with us before, and it is just the time when we need the expertise of former staffers on the Senate Judiciary Committee to guide us through where we are now. And I want to get your reaction to the Republicans on this committee now, including Jeff Flake, who seemed to be sounding reasonable early in the week, holding on to this position that there's absolutely no time for an FBI investigation.
Well, Lawrence, I think you're right. I think it's absurd. And as you set up the contrast, as bad as Anita Hill was treated by the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991, Dr. Blasey Ford is being treated even worse by Chairman Grassley, and for two reasons. You noted one of the reasons, which is she asked that the FBI do its investigation first. And the tapes that you just ran show that Senator Grassley and Senator Hatch both talked about that being a longstanding precedent, that being the obvious first step, and exactly what needs to happen next. Regardless, Chuck Grassley is denying Dr. Blasey Ford that, and apparently the administration is denying it as well. And I think that will cause a lot of people to wonder why. Why don't they want the FBI to go out and investigate these claims? Dr. Blasey Ford wants it investigated. But the second thing that Chairman Grassley is doing to treat her even worse than Anita Hill is he is saying that only two people can testify, only Dr. Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. That is worse treatment than Anita Hill received. There were outside witnesses that she was able to call that corroborated her account. They are not allowing Dr. Ford to do the same thing, which really shows what are they hiding. It really causes that to come into light, that as bad as Anita Hill was treated, that they're doing even worse to Dr. Blasey Ford. And the question is why? What are they hiding?
I want to read Dr. Ford's lawyer's response to Senator Grassley tonight. Issued a statement saying the committee's stated plan to move forward with a hearing that has only two witnesses is not a fair or good faith investigation. There are multiple witnesses whose names have appeared publicly and should be included in any proceeding. The rush to a hearing is unnecessary and contrary to the committee discovering the truth. And Lisa, as Christine just said, and the point I've made, they are offering Dr. Ford much worse terms, much worse circumstance than they offered Anita Hill. And we know how badly the Anita Hill hearing went, and you would think that this committee had learned something from that, but it seems like what they learned from it was don't even be as fair to the witness as we were to Anita Hill.
Well, it's really shocking, as Christine said, and as you point out, they've concocted some idea that it's unprecedented to seek FBI, a follow-on set of work by the FBI, a supplemental background investigation to examine this, when their own words reveal how false those statements are. And the Department of Justice is complicit in echoing them, that this is somehow outside the purview of the background investigation. Christine and I, between us, have read hundreds of FBI files. We know this is not how this process works. The American people are being lied to by Senator Grassley about this process. And I was shocked to have him suggest that this was some sort of separation of powers issue, that they couldn't commandeer the executive branch to do this investigation. The fact is that there's never been a time in which a ranking member and chairman have not agreed to request information in circumstances like this where further investigation is obviously necessary. And Lord knows that Brett Kavanaugh has time on his hands. He spent the last 3 days ensconced at the White House doing a murder board, basically, to try to figure out what he's going to say, what level of umbrage he's going to take, how he's going to answer questions about something he claims he doesn't know anything about. He could have been interviewed already, but the chairman is singularly standing in the way of that precedent, and he's lying to the public about this and presumably to the other members of that committee. Jeff Flake is being sold a bill of goods if he believes Senator Grassley about the precedent on this committee. What's unprecedented is to have this matter not go back to the FBI for further investigation by people who are professionals and know how to do just that.
And Christine, we're now seeing, in effect, Jeff Flake and Susan Collins gang up on Dr. Ford, saying, well, of course she should show up on Monday at 10 a.m., as if there's absolutely no other space on the calendar for this.
Yeah, it's absurd that this would have to happen next Monday. What would happen in the normal course of a bipartisan process is that the chair and ranking would work with the witnesses to make sure that they could make it. What I found surprising this week is you had Chairman Grassley announce that she was coming when we now know that there was no agreement, there was no back and forth discussion with her to accommodate this survivor of sexual assault. So it just seems like a completely different process than Lisa or I were involved in when we worked on the committee. And one other point I'd like to make, you mentioned your experience earlier, Lawrence, when Senator Grassley was on the Finance Committee when you were there. My experience with Senator Grassley when I was on the committee is he was really independent. He was principled. He kept his word. And also he likes to really protect whistleblowers. What I am surprised about here is how he is treating what I consider to be a whistleblower, which is Dr. Blasey Ford, risking everything to come forward and tell her story. And he's not treating her with the same accord that I saw him treat whistleblowers over the years when I worked on the committee. So it's particularly surprising to me, given how he's acting in this instance, because I had seen him over the years be very protective of the confidentiality or the need for protection for whistleblowers who are risking their careers and their privacy to come forward to inform the committee.
And Lisa, I want to get your reaction about that and your personal view of both Senators Grassley and Hatch. And let me just throw in parentheses here. On the Senate Finance Committee, where I worked with both of them, I have to say it was a very good working relationship. They were on the other side of almost all the issues, but they were responsible, and everyone thought they were, solid, responsible Republicans on that side of the table, and we never had the slightest reason to question their integrity about anything. It's a very different environment with different tensions than the Judiciary Committee has, and so it disappoints me on a personal level greatly to be saying these things about either one of them, and to be saying them about both of them bothers me a lot. But Lisa, tell me about your experience with both Senator Grassley and Senator Hatch.
Well, having observed them up close, what I can tell you is that whatever solicitousness they display in terms of getting legislation passed, for example, trying to reach a compromise on legislation, on the issue of judicial nominations, they've adopted an extremely hard line. That hard line has basically either forced them or compelled them to break rule after rule after rule in order to force these judges onto the court at the lower court level, as well as now for the Supreme Court vacancy. When it comes to the judicial appointments process, no rule is allowed to stand in their way, no history, no precedent, no practice. And there's some irony there where you have a person being chosen to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to interpret our laws being put onto the court potentially in violation of almost every norm and practice and precedent of the Senate and the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Lisa Graves and Christine Lucius, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really need your expertise on this. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.